Yeah. All right, we're live. Time for us to begin our Bible study. We're continuing to look at the character of Abraham. If you'd like to go ahead and open up, we're going to start our reviewing in Genesis chapter 12. At the end of chapter 11, we find the introduction of his genealogy and his father. But then when we get to chapter 12 is where we start to find that initial contact and the call, what I call, the call of Abram. Which is a great father, the name which is very appropriate. He's going to end up being a great father. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Our most blessed Father, we're so humbled as we consider your wisdom that we read through your word, and especially the stories that we can learn from, these characters that we're looking at, like Abraham, Jonah, Noah, all of them that we can look through and study and develop something that's real about our own lives and how we as well can remain faithful and serve you. We pray that you be with us during this class. Help us to be able to put aside the things that have been busy in our minds and our hearts, and help us to be able to grow wiser in your word. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So we find that he starts this call, and right away in 12:1, we find that call was very distinct. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred, so go from your family, go from your land and your house to a land I'll show you. And in that promise he gave him, he said, I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, I'll give you a great name, and you will be a blessing. And also this other part, now remember this is interesting because this is before he even leaves, that those who bless you will be blessed, those who dishonor you I will curse, and so he leaves. He takes Lot with him, which is tonight. We're going to look at the involvement there in the relationship. Him and Sarai, they don't have any children. He is at the age of 75, which would put her around 65. So when they leave, so he's 75 years old, and he's been promised this blessing, which he understands as this being his own descendants are going to be a part of this blessing from the very first time. They arrive in what is modern kind of, well, I say modern, but where Joshua crossed over, remember Jericho and Ai and Bethel? That's where he first arrives, goes there, he builds an altar, he worships, he's there for a while. So he's in the land of Canaan, and this is the land that God has promised that he's going to give to all the people and all his descendants eventually. And then a famine strikes. And when this famine strikes, I think this is where we see the real faith being tested and trying to understand what's going on. I mean, God said he would take care of him. He knew these blessings. He held on to them. But there's a part where sometimes, we make bad decisions. And maybe it's a bad decision, or maybe it was just a bad decision the way he behaved, as far as going to take care of his family. Because they're hungry. And it's not just him, is it? I mean, we know it's not just Lot either. It's Lot's family. It's also the servants that he has. So he goes to Egypt, but then when he gets down there, we see that the Pharaoh discovers her through the princes. It says in 12:15, if you want to jump on down to 15, when he arrives there, the Egyptians see. Now, he'd already conspired with her and said, you're a beautiful woman. When we get there, you're going to, be looked at, and if we're married, they're going to kill me and take you. So tell everybody you're my sister. Half truth, right? Because he is their half brother and sister. So they get down there, the princes of the Pharaoh in 15, they see her, and they go and report to Pharaoh. Pharaoh then, of course, for her sake, he gives oxen, it says female servants, female donkeys, camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh's family in his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. This brings up, I think when we think about this, is how does that play into, is this Pharaoh's fault? I mean, this is, why is God, it's kind of one of those deep questions, you go, it was their lie, and she went along with it. And yet, Pharaoh and his household being punished. I think there's more behind this than what we understand, possibly. It also is an association, I think, that where Pharaoh, without a doubt, will know that this man, Abram and Sarai, are very unique and very special relationship with God. And that this God had the power to hurt Pharaoh and afflict him in his house. So I think it kind of reconfirms the power of this God, of this Abram and Sarai. He makes a good statement, why do you do this? That's one of those things where it's interesting. You would think, well, God's blessed me, because you could look at it, well, I lied, yes, but God blessed me because I got all these oxen and donkeys and stuff. And Pharaoh had to let go of my wife, and she's back with me. But, the conscience has to be a little bit stricken whenever you think about Pharaoh saying, wait a minute, what have you done? So they leave. And when they return to the land, he kind of journeys far out of Egypt up north, goes back up, and I got a little map we'll look at. But when they get there, we see that they have grown. They're growing in wealth. They're growing in livestock, continually prospering. And so when they go up in 13:5 and 7, chapter 13, verse 5 and 7, we read, now when Lot, who was traveling with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents, but the land could not support them while they were living side by side, because their possessions were so great. They were not able to live alongside one another. So there were quarrels between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. So this is setting up a whole other story, as we know. And Abram, we know, gives him a choice, doesn't he?
Yeah. He said, you get to choose which way you want to go, but we need to separate. So do you think God was saying, okay, I'm going to separate you, and the servants aren't going to get along? And so I told Abram to come out, but he took you with him. I didn't command him to bring you with him.
Yes, that is an interesting thread there, to think about that. He said depart and leave your family, but he takes Lot. I'd never really looked at it that way, that possibly, this is God's way of having him removed, providentially.
And dividing.
Yeah. And we don't ever see them back together, other than when he rescues them.
Yeah.
And then they stay apart. And then, of course, after Sodom and Gomorrah, we don't hear of Lot again. Well, we have a little bit trailing story about him. But so he doesn't want to have strife, but he allows him to make that choice. I heard I was reading somewhere a while back about how that Lot should have yielded to Abram. And, kind of like out of respect. And saying, no, you deserve to pick the better land, because you're the patriarch, and you deserve, and so you should be the one picking. And so because of this little bit of a selfishness, because it says, what did he do? He looked down and he saw the land and he saw it was good, so he chooses to go down the Jordan Valley, and that's where he heads east. They separate. Now this is where I've got the map. Hopefully it'll come up pretty good. This is from Bible CA. They got some really good maps and resources and graphs and stuff if you want to go there and use that as a resource. Steve Rudd. It's bible.ca. It's not so, not that great. Let's see if I can. But if we're to kind of look at this, we see the Salt Sea, and then this up here is where Ai, Jordan, but down here is where Hebron. He first moves up to Ai and Bethel. Then he comes back down after they separate. And this is believed, this right here is where we see the Sodom and Gomorrah, which I do believe that is the most appropriate. It seems to be archaeologically that they are supporting that. But just to throw a wrench in everything, there is actually up here, you see my little up in this area here?
Yeah.
There is another city that did have a name that was Sodom. But I don't. I think most believe that it was all down in this region here, in this fertile valley, which is after the Sodom and Gomorrah incident is no longer fertile. So then we read about this So I think that when we look at the story of Lot and Abraham, I think that's an important one because we're going to see many things that spin off from that. We see the idea of Lot choosing his direction, Abram staking to where he's going to stay, and then as we lose kind of track of Lot, but we have an idea that he seems to be migrating towards the big cities. Because remember, I've always wondered this, but we're never really told. But who's watching all the flock while he's standing at the gate at Sodom? When the angels come to the city, remember? And he's at the gate, living in the city?
Yeah.
So what happened? I mean, they had so many herdsmen, so many livestock, that Lot and Abraham had to separate. But later on, we're going to see where all of a sudden, Lot is living inside the city as a city folk person. We have no idea about what
Hiding himself in his house.
happened. Well, hiding or just why? Why is he there? I mean, I can't see. Let's just say let's go back to the cowboy days when we had ranches in America, not modern cities. But, even the McDonald house up here in Dripping Springs, they had a summer house and a winter house, but they stayed near the ranch. You go out to most of the ranches, they stayed where they could manage and be involved with the livestock.
A lot of the rich ranchers, though, they have their hands out there doing the ranching. They live in Denver or someplace like that. Maybe that's what Lot was doing.
I thought that too. I think that's a good point to remind ourselves of. It doesn't mean that he's not managing it. I'm assuming. I just think that it just kind of hit me one time where I'm thinking, wow, here's this great herdsman, they've got all these livestock, and all of a sudden, the next time we hear about him, he's standing at the city gate. And his house is inside the city.
Yeah.
So, yes, you're right, Gary. I think that's very good.
Even here in town, Mrs. Sage, that Rock House over there by the university, they had 3 or 4 ranches, but their house is there by the university. It's now called GameStop.
Mm-hmm. They were also, yeah, and that is possible, yes. But it does, I think the moral side of this as well kind of indicates that the fact that he moved his house into a city was not good. I mean, the idea that he was becoming more affiliated, he's going to become more and more affiliated with Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, this 5 kings against 4. There's 4 kings. I'm not going to go through all the names because most of them I can't pronounce, but the different areas, they're named. 3 of them are named, and one of them's not. He's generic. Bera, king of Sodom. And then we have Gomorrah. But all these kings end up being basically attacked by a group of another outside kings who decide to come into that region there and to go ahead and basically submit. Some historians have said submitting them to tribute or just occupy, to expand their territory. But the whole point, honestly, is the idea that they get caught up. A little bit of ironic because 5 of the kings get together. They go out and meet them on the battlefield, Sodom and Gomorrah and all those kings. They get out there, and they end up getting whooped pretty bad. And in that, then they just basically go through and pillage the territory, pillage the city, and take everything. And, of course, who gets swept up in this? Lot. So, but it's kind of interesting that they're being attacked and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah flee, and most of their army falls into these tar pits, basically. In chapter 14, verse 10, describes the tar pits, or the pits that they fall into. The enemy take all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they take off. And they take Lot. They take his possessions.
Said they fled, but some of them said they fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. That's in 10, the end of 10.
Yeah, because the kings don't die. Some of them fall in the pit. They get defeated and they scatter.
Oh.
it's kind of a mix because we talked about some fell into them and the rest fled to the hills at the end of 10. Some fell into those pits, and then the rest fled to the hill country. So there's nobody left to defend the country. Nobody left to defend the civilians. And so these other kings just basically come in and just take and pillage everything. In that, it's kind of, I don't know if this is a prelude to a judgment that's coming on these cities, because Sodom, Gomorrah, these 5 cities, these kings. That's the other thing is, when we talk about a king today, we think of a kingdom, a territory, a place, like the King of England. These were city-states. So you had kings of cities. Not like...
Kingdoms.
Yeah, not like I said, the King of England, the King of France, the King of Germany, the Tsar. No, these were small. At this point, societies are not grouping into much larger areas. Even Egypt, it has a pharaoh, which would be their equivalent to the king or the emperor, or however you want to call him, the pharaoh. That one is a larger area. Egypt is going to develop faster into a much larger geographic power. But these areas, these 5 cities, are also representative of they would be a king. If you'll notice that we'll run across this guy pretty quick here, is Melchizedek. King of Salem, that's a city, see? And there's a lot of meaning, but that kind of helps to show that when we talk about these kings, it wasn't like huge nation behind them. But it seems to be, this idea that this attack by these outside kings coming into this area may be a prelude to a judgment. We see that that's kind of what God alludes to, the fact to Abraham, even on the judgment that's going to come onto the people of Canaan after 400 years of the people being in Egypt, because he says what? Their sins are not yet full. So, there's this idea where God's mercy continually tries to allow these nations to repent. And this is maybe, but I think that if you look at the conditions, the way God interacts with nations, the way we see that he does, it's possibly a prelude to wake them up and say, hey, you guys are on the wrong road. And then later on, we're going to see where they end up being destroyed. But one escapes in 13. He's a Hebrew. He comes, he escaped, and he told Abram, and we know the location again, who was living by the oaks of Mamre. And he informs him that his kinsman has been taken. So he leads out 318 men. Now that's fighting men, okay? So how many people are with Abram's influence? Family, right? That's like Egypt. When they come out, they say like 600,000. That's probably about 1 million people. Because when they list, usually it's just the men. So here we have 318. But that's still, I don't know what the numbers are, but if you've got 4 kings that have just gone to war and they're fleeing with the bounty, to be able to overcome them with 318, it's so they pursue him as far as Dan. Now, other translations it says, and it does map out as being basically Damascus, which is in modern-day Syria, north, which is quite a distance. Now remember, they're not to overcome them, which of course they're going to be traveling slower. They're not going to be able to travel as fast and as light as Abram with his men, because they're going to be moving with all the bounty, right? All the booty they captured and all the people and the livestock they've taken. So they're going to be slower.
They took every bit of Lot's.
Yeah, they took all of his stuff. So they've got a lot that they're loaded down with as they maneuver away from the area trying to get back. So he does have that advantage, but it's still pretty much a foot pursuit and to catch up to them. Now there is a thing on History Channel, probably on YouTube now, but I watched it years ago, and it's a military tactician who takes battles from the Old Testament and applies tactics and shows how these played out. Joshua, the invasion, the conquest of Jordan and stuff. And it's an amazing, because he takes kind of the secular, logical, military application and puts it to these Bible stories. And he says, this one is one of the most amazing, but yet nobody gets it. Because if you don't know tactics and you're not a military person, this one here, along with Gideon's, is one of the most amazing, he said, was this idea of the way he divides his forces, which is a pincer move. So the way he comes around and offsets, he's able to make his forces look larger and hit them simultaneously from different locations by night. Now think about it. They don't have flashlights, right? They don't have night vision goggles like our Navy SEALs. So can you imagine walking? Hopefully they had a full moon. I mean, we're assuming what the starlight was like. But, you know, if you've ever done it, you can actually, I think outside of, if you got into a very dense wooded area, when I was at Fort Bragg, man, I don't care how my night vision, I could never get it to where I could see in the dark. But I know out here in the desert, even when I've been mountain biking, I've turned off my lights and rode with no lights. But I could only do it if I was going away from the city. Once I turned around and started going back, that light would mess me up. But I could see. You just shut your eyes, let your eyes adjust. So it's something that's incredible because it's doable with the light. And being in this geographic area, I think that it's very possible that they could maneuver. They could see. And they could see to be able to. But what a surprise. Because what do you do with this large amount of people that are moving along? You know, by the evening, they're exhausted. They break up. They set up camp. And then they're relaxing. They're watering their animals. They're getting up their shelter for the evening, eating dinner. And then they go to sleep. They're probably exhausted from the walk. Perfect timing. A night attack. And he does. It's interesting. He doesn't really talk about, just says that, you know, they defeated him and they pursued him north of Damascus. So he didn't just overrun them and whoop them and stuff and let them go. I mean, he continued to press the attack. Which, why would he do that?
Why continue to press?
Yeah, why would he continue to press this attack? He's got his relatives back. You know, I mean, he hasn't been commissioned to go get revenge. He hasn't, you know, by the other kings. He's not like a mercenary little army that's going out. His sole purpose was to go do what? Go get Lot and his family. So he defeats them. He's won. But he doesn't stop there. He pursues them. This is where, if you're military, you understand. You do not allow them to regroup because they'll counterattack. So he had to pursue them and ensure that they weren't going to come back tomorrow night and attack them. And the only way he had to press it, keep the pressure on. As soon as he initiated that attack at dark, had to continue that pursuit and keep them off their ability to organize, and then not give them the opportunity as well to then regroup and get a day's rest and then come back in 2 days and chase him.
Especially at night, right? Once you get them around and keep them moving, then they get more panicky.
And then, and then you got to turn around and guess what? You've got to go back with the same burden of people and livestock, and now you're vulnerable.
Think of all the noise.
What's that?
The noise. You would think that they would hear them. They're pursuing them, but it's just like there's so much noise. You'd think they would know that they're still coming after them.
Well, I think if you saw the way they probably attacked, these are just 318 men. They're probably not carrying much at all. So they're able to move pretty quietly. And they've got the ability to be organized. And I, you know, we don't, again, it's kind of a presumption, but I am sure they just didn't haphazardly go, hey, half of you guys go over there and half of us come over here, and then when it's over with, let's pursue them. No, I think there's somebody, which was probably Abram at this time, you know, was giving them this strategy.
But it says they brought back all the goods and the wives and the women and all the people, and all this good, so he still had all those animals, and so that takes a lot to keep them herded up.
Yes. That's what I mean. The advantage is lost. So once Abraham wins and he gets them all back, it's interesting. You notice one thing, he could have done is say, Lot, your family, your 2 daughters, get all your livestock, let's go, and just go.
Yeah.
But he doesn't.
No,
He brings everybody back.
and all of his goods too.
All of it.
He rewarded him. It's almost like God rewarded him.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But just the maneuvering back and the idea that why did he take everyone back? It shows a characteristic trait, I think, of Abram, that he's not just thinking about his own, but he's thinking about the victims of what occurred, the violence that was probably inflicted upon their families, their wives and stuff, and seeing the injustice of this that occurred. And so he's going to bring them back and reintegrate them back to their family, back to their land and stuff, and take care of them and transport them back. But like I said, from a military point of view, now you're the one that's vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why when we look at the why, and I ask that question, why did he pursue him? It makes logical, tactical sense, because if he doesn't make sure that they're no longer a threat, as soon as he turns that mob and group around and starts heading south, all they got to do is now come and attack him and hit him as he's going back. So he's got to make sure that the enemy is destroyed. So that's why. So, but he brings back all these possessions and brings them all back. And now when he arrives, this is where we come into probably one of the most important shadows. And what do I mean by shadow? We talk about a shadow. Something that is reflecting the real thing in the future. Something that God is trying to teach by giving us a story like a parable or something, an action or historical event that will reflect later on what the actual end of the promise that God is going to give us. And that comes in the form of this Melchizedek. Mm-hmm. And so jumping to 14, if you want to. And there are some pretty fascinating things about this encounter. Because we start at 17 there, we see where after the return of the defeat of those kings, that the kings come out and they meet him. And then we find in 18 Melchizedek of Salem, which means peace, right? So there's a lot of the words just in the words alone about Melchizedek. And now look what Melchizedek brings out: bread and wine. Now, all the other kings, they basically say, you can have, just take most of the wealth. And Abram's like, no, I'm not going to do that. He said, I'm not. And it's interesting. So you have one king, Melchizedek, who comes out and gives an offering of bread and wine. And you have these other kings who are basically offering worldly wealth, is what I'm trying to get at. I'm brains bedazzled, but which is more important? Bread, wine, well, they probably have supplies, right? I mean, it's not like maybe he needs bread or wine, but gold, silver, cattle, livestock that he can gain because these other
I'm
kings.
thinking bread and wine. Bread is the body, and wine is the.
That's a shadow.
The shadow.
Mm-hmm. But it also starts to pull out a rich understanding of what Abraham sees in Melchizedek. Now, Moses, in writing Genesis, says, he tells us in the parentheses there in 18, he was a priest of God Most High. Mm-hmm. I believe Abraham knew this. I don't know why he wouldn't. I think when we look at the engagement they have and the interaction that they're having with one another, that they both know each other. However it is, I don't know. But whether it's completely providential spiritually, but there seems to be this spiritual engagement between these two men that have a very special relationship with God. One of them, Abram, has been promised the covenant relationship with God and this blessing that's going to follow through him. And then we see Melchizedek being a priest who is serving God. What law is Melchizedek serving? I mean, we think of priests. Who do you think of? I don't know about you, but I think of especially God. When you say God and priest, what priest would you think of? Aaron. Now, Aaron, what did they minister under? A law, a Mosaic law. So I'm asking, have you ever thought about what is Melchizedek ministering under? What law? What covenant? We don't know. Well, we're not told. This is where, I remember we're about 400 or 500 years after the flood. You know, some say 200 or so years after the flood. And we see that after the Tower of Babel, I started out this whole series looking at Abram, how that historical pinnacle point of history was the Tower of Babel, and dividing the people back up into nations and languages. And most of them were turning back to themselves and creating their own gods. We see the god of Baal, Moloch arrive, these pantheon of pagan gods being developed by people. But then we see Melchizedek. Now what's interesting is, why didn't God pick Melchizedek? I mean, he picked Abram. Melchizedek's in the land. He doesn't have to travel anywhere. Who's more righteous, if Abram or Melchizedek?
Abram, he went by faith.
Not yet. We'll see it. He says it. Well, the whole thing is, but, I mean, a priest?
Abram says Melchizedek here.
What's that?
Abram deferred to Melchizedek, so
Yes.
it looks like Melchizedek is favored over Abram.
Now I'm really digging deep.
And those people back then, the patriarchs, God talked to them, and you can assume that he talked to Melchizedek.
Absolutely. I think that's the unsaid part where you have to have this necessary logical conclusion, is that there is some way, and that's why we talk about this being the patriarch period of the head of the families, where God directly was revealing his will, just like with Cain and Abel, going all the way back to the garden, where they knew to worship and to sacrifice, but were never told any specific instructions, where God brought the two brothers together and said, all right, sit down. This is how you're going to do it. You're going to worship. And this is what I want. But we know there was, by what? Well, one was accepted, one was rejected. So there is something going on that we always know, where God is making himself known. That's kind of my point. There's also an aspect that's flowing through all of this as well, of a righteousness that's obtained with God, with what I consider a universal law that has existed from the time that he created us, and that will exist till the end of time. It is never changing. What you find changing will be covenant relationships. That's it. You know, the morality issues were always the same from the beginning of those two brothers to Adam and Eve, and it'll be the same. The New Testament did not change the moral code of the Mosaic law. It's always been the same, and man can always know it. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 1, when he says about the condition of people and what they did. Even though they could know God, and he doesn't mean by just looking around and go, wow, somebody really, really powerful made this place. It was more than just that. That was the evidence of it, but that God makes himself known. And so with Melchizedek, God has made himself known to him, and I think he's ministering a sacrificial services very similar to what he had instructed Cain and Abel. Very similar to what do we see Abraham doing when he comes in and sets up at places? Builds an altar and sacrifices. So we see this blood atonement already started with Cain and Abel and continued all the way through. Even when Noah comes out, he offered a sacrifice. So this is something that's always consistent, is this atonement sacrifice of blood that was superficial because it was temporary, but it's something God was requiring. So that was something, this ministering or this priesthood that he was doing here. And very much so, I think that this idea, and Becky, you said it, the bread and the wine, the body and the blood. In the sacrifice, it's going to be the shadowing. We know the Hebrew writer. The Hebrew writer just ties it all together, doesn't he, when he talks about Melchizedek. The Hebrew writer gives you the actual item, and he says that it's Jesus. But over in Hebrews 7:1, he says, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and he blessed him. And to Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation, his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, that is, of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning or of days nor end of days, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how, continuing in Hebrews 7:4, see how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment to the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from the brothers. Through these also descended from Abraham. So what he's trying to show there, in this showing the superiority of Christ's priesthood, he's revealing what the actual was, the high priesthood of Melchizedek, and the importance of it, and who pays who honor. Usually it's the lesser. So Abraham, like Gary, you brought up, was the fact that he showed honor by paying a 10th to Melchizedek. This is the beauty of this, is because later on in the New Testament, the New Covenant, they're basically now showing why the priesthood of Melchizedek was superior to Aaron's. Because Aaron basically gave tithes to Melchizedek because he was still inside the genealogy, the gene pool of Abraham. So therefore, by default, the Levites gave tribute to the superior Melchizedek. Now, Salem, the location is also important. It's going to come up again. Location, location, location is this city, which is going to be Jerusalem, where we're going to see where they come along. So that's, and then he blesses him. Melchizedek blesses Abram by saying in 19, back over into Genesis in our text, chapter 14, 19, and he blessed him, said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And that's where then 21, where the king Sodom tells him, just let me have the people and you keep everything else. And Abram, look what he says. He says, I've lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, which means I swore, in other words, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that's yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. This is a dependence on God. This is something where, if you're in the world and you have no retirement plan and you're living by the moment, in one moment you could have something natural wipe out your animals and wipe everything out. You want to get as much as you can, and you feel like you're the one that's going to provide for that. This is a part of this where God is telling Abram, and Abram's reflecting that and saying, look, no one's going to be able to say that somehow you helped me survive and be rich or made me who I am. Nobody does. Only God. Now, is there something there for us as Christians? Hi, Eileen, the Hayneses. I'm sorry, I saw that you were with us. I didn't.
Don't say that you're the one who made yourself wealthy. And you pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps. We depend on God. And we should give thanks to God for all that we have.
We let God be the one that's going to provide for us. Depend upon Him and rely on Him and have faith that He's going to provide that for us. So then we can also understand that it's not the world that blesses us, it's God as well. So, we'll...
But it does say, I think it's in Psalms or Proverbs, that you can count on the heathen to provide for you.
Yes, I think that there are, and God has said He'd take from them and give to you.
Yes.
You know, that there is that. I think with this, Abram is a huge learning lesson to everybody in that region. Because remember, most of them are pagan worshipers, and they're worshiping, and they believe they can prosper through themselves, through the worldly possessions and such. And here comes this man who has this one God, Yahweh, and he's just fruitful. You know, I mean, he goes down, he gets in trouble, God blesses him. I mean, he just continues to grow and grow and grow. We're going to stop there because we got kids in the back class, and so usually I could go up till 8, but just so that we can kind of wrap up. It wasn't fair to them because they were having to stay out for forever. So I'm going to start trying to wrap up the class around 7:45 so they can go ahead and come on out. So if you got any closing comments or thoughts, we'll pick up with the covenant, because that's another part of the covenant that we see parts of it and how it's fulfilled and how it's brought out even today, and how we are also being blessed by that covenant. Thoughts, concerns, wrap up?
I'm trying to find that verse that says that even the heathens will be watching you, will be watching the righteous, because they will be jealous of what God has done for you.
Well, I would like to share with you some news about the YouTube. Our last Sunday we had our average watch is around 40 to 50 on, after about, 3 or 4 live views, we get about 20 maybe while we're having it. This last Sunday, I guess it's because of the lesson, which is great, but we had 176 views in just 3 days. With just that one lesson. So I think that's great, because it's a good topic, looking at the resurrection. So I hope that it will continue to spread that hope out there. All right, well, I don't have any comments. Anybody want to discuss anything? So we'll go ahead and wrap up the class. We hope that you'll be able to join us next week again at 6 p.m. We'll continue. If you want to pick up in Genesis 15 and read on through there, the covenant relationship and the covenant promises that he's going to talk about there, and how that Abraham is found righteous. This is in chapter 15, verses 5 and 6 is where we'll see that. With that, we hope that you'll be back next week, and hopefully you'll be able to come down and join us Sunday morning, 9:45, for our Bible study again, all online, and in worship at 10:45. All right, that's all I got. God bless.